Okay, so if you are watching this, that means that you need to be doing the Imperialism, Reteach, and Remediation. I will be checking your notes before I grade a reassessment, so make sure that you are taking some good, detailed, thorough notes. Okay, so to recap what imperialism is all about power and control. And so it's when one country extends their power over another country. This can be done through economic means, controlling trade and business. This could be through political means, controlling governments and laws. It might be using military force, or it could be cultural, so influencing things like gender expectations, religion, schooling, language. So there's three main reasons why Americans want to imperialize. One is because our capitalists want new markets. So we want more access to other people to sell our goods to trade with, to buy from. And if these places are part of the US, it'll be much easier. We also just have a desire to keep expanding. We reached the West Coast. We've expanded from ocean to ocean, and we just want more land, more territory. Also, Americans believed that they were exceptional, that our culture and our way of life was better than other people's culture and other people's way of life. So we would go to less developed nations and we would try to bring our values there, things like Christianity and democracy. Okay, so now we're going to look at this general overview. This is basically all the stuff we've talked about with American imperialism and American expansion. You might, I'm going to say more than is on this slide, but you might end up needing to pause so that you can write some extra stuff down to make sure your notes are nice and full. Okay, so late 1800s, the U.S. joins the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War was really between Spain and Cuba. Cuba was fighting for their independence. They did not want to be controlled by Spain anymore. And so the U.S. joins the war on the side of Cuba. And as a result, we get a bunch of territories. So we get Puerto Rico, we get the Philippines, and we get Guam, all places that were previously controlled by Spain, but then that control was transferred to America. Cuba does not come under American control. Cuba wanted their independence. We were fighting to help give them their independence, so they become independent. So we do not imperialize in Cuba. Finally, Hawaii. So the U.S. annexes Hawaii during the war, which means we take over Hawaii, and they become kind of de facto part of the United States. Okay, so focusing a little bit more on right here, looking at Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico became a U.S. territory and is still a U.S. territory. So they have to follow U.S. laws. They have to pay U.S. taxes. Not all Puerto Ricans pay all U.S. taxes, but some. And they're not allowed to vote. So there is quite some controversy about the state of Puerto Rico and whether or not they should remain a territory or become something else. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Wait for the bell. Okay. So now looking more at the Philippines. So the Philippines, they really fight back against American imperialism. They want to be independent. They'd been under Spanish control for centuries and they are sick of it. So we end up fighting in the Philippine-American War. And we do win that war. It takes a few years. The Philippines fight hard, but we do win that war. But along the way, we take lots of Filipino people prisoner as criminals for fighting, and there are many deaths. So about 20,000 Filipino people died during this war. After winning, we really start to send more and more Christian missionaries, but not just any Christian, specifically Protestants. Spain was a Catholic country, and they had been pushing Catholicism in the Philippines. And we didn't like Catholicism. We didn't think that it was fully Christian and that it encouraged bad behaviors like gambling and drinking. So we start really pushing Protestantism in the Philippines. So we convert local texts, or we convert texts into local languages. We set up schools, reward people who do convert with leadership positions. So that push is pretty successful, but there is some pushback with Filipino people and their own leaders, specifically saying that the U.S. was racist towards the Filipino people. Eventually, the Philippines does gain their sovereignty, which means that they become independent. They're their own country. They get to have their own government in 1946. But the United States was still very influential in terms of trade and having military bases set up. Okay, so looking more at Hawaii. So Hawaii, which we annexed during the conflict, Hawaii is really important to the U.S. because of economic reasons. So Hawaii is really central for trading, and they have some unique crops that we think would be really good for commerce and for selling. Hawaiians aren't excited about being part of the United States. They have a really deep and rich culture, and they have their own leadership. They have a queen, but we come in and we change that, and they're not happy. So they protest, they sign petitions, they fight back against being annexed, but eventually they do indeed become a state. It takes about 60 years. So Hawaii is a state today, but it was not really an easy road to get there. Okay, so looking more at Puerto Rico. So this is definitely a political form of imperialism, right? We force them to follow our laws, and they are part of the United States. So their government is largely based on our government. So there's some debate about whether or not Puerto Rico should become a state, whether or not they should be a territory still, or whether or not they should just be an independent nation. So a couple of the reasons in favor of Puerto Rico becoming a state is that Puerto Ricans currently aren't really treated like full citizens. They're treated more like second-class citizens. If someone is treated like a second-class citizen, it just means that they're treated worse and not really fairly or equally to full citizens. Another main reason in favor of Puerto Rico becoming a state is because some people, and this is definitely a political argument, so particularly people on the left will say that conservatives are just denying voting rights to Puerto Ricans, and that voting is a right, and that Puerto Ricans should have that right. So there's also some arguments against Puerto Rico becoming a state. One of them looks back at the original intent in the 1800s when we first take Puerto Rico as a territory. So that first argument is that Puerto Rico was never intended to be a state. If it wasn't the original intent, it shouldn't happen now. The second reason against Puerto Rico being a state is also political. This one is more focused on the right side of the political spectrum, saying that Puerto Rico becoming a state is like a scheme done by liberal politicians who are trying to get more voters to support their causes. The theory there being that most Puerto Ricans would align more left politically. Okay, looking a little more at the Philippine-American War. On the left, we can see some schools that were set up by Americans in the Philippine Islands. So remember, education is definitely a form of cultural imperialism. What children are learning in schools really influences the values and the way that a society thinks and what they believe. And so setting up free public education is a good way to push American values, things like democracy and Christianity. On the right side, we can see some women who were seeking help from American soldiers. A big form of the cultural imperialism that we talked about was white man's burden and American ideas about civilizing uncivilized people, helping people who we saw as needing help. So there's an example of that, and with some gender influences as well. A couple more pictures looking more at the military aspect of the war as opposed to the cultural aspects. So in the Philippine-American War, we took lots of lives. There were lots of people who died in this fairly short conflict. It lasted a few years, but still a fairly short conflict. Over 20,000 Filipino people died fighting for independence. And then we took a lot of people prisoner. So we would portray the rebel fighters, so the insurrectionists, the Filipino people who wanted independence. We would portray them as criminals, putting them in jail, taking them captive, including even some of the major leaders of the rebellion in the Philippines. Okay, last thing here, looking a little bit closer at the economic side of imperialism. One of the major reasons why we wanted Hawaii and wanted to control and have influence in Hawaii is because of trade. And so you can see with the image here, Hawaii is really central compared to like 4 other major continents. So we are able to trade a lot easier and use Hawaii as like a way station for trade. Hawaii also has a different climate than most of the United States. So Hawaii is able to grow crops that we can't grow in the continental United States. So things like pineapples. And we wanted to be able to sell pineapples and make money off of them. The other economic factor I want to talk about briefly is the Panama Canal. So the Panama Canal, shown right here, runs through Panama. And what it does is connect, essentially, the Caribbean and the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. There's not a lot of ways to get from the Atlantic side of the United States to the Pacific side of the United States. The Panama Canal is the major waterway to do that. So controlling the Panama Canal is huge for a country's economic stability. It's huge for like their military to be able to use that for travel and for transport. And so the US in the early 1900s is the one that comes in, builds this canal, really starts that process for it to be a usable feature in the world. And this really benefits our economy. Okay, so that is all of the reteach instruction. If you need to rewatch this video or go back and pause so you can finish filling out your notes, please do. Like I said at the beginning, I will be checking your notes before I regrade any reassessments. Please also come see me if you have any questions. Thank you, guys.